There are probably 50 witnesses who testified, including the bar and tavern owner at Finnegan's, about DJ's deportment and behavior in the hours before his death. They were universally complimentary of him. The bar owner, who obviously serves a great deal of underage liquor in his bar, doesn't seem to be much dispute about that, said that he remembered DJ out of the 100+ people present because when DJ left to go outside to speak with someone who was outside, he actually asked the bar owner whether he could leave and come back in. And he said that was very unusually polite behavior. In any event, so DJ left, was waiting in a fire lane with two of his friends in a vehicle. He was driving the vehicle. Someone knocked, police officer knocked on a window. DJ took that knock to be scoot, started driving, probably achieved a speed of maybe 15 miles an hour as he drove away. But as he curved around a pretty steep curve, apparently perceived the police officer in the middle of the road and was slowing down. Police officer lunges on the car, and by the police officer's estimate, within 1 second, had fired 4 shots, 3 of which killed DJ. As this was transpiring, another police officer about 30 feet away, a 30-year veteran of the Mount Pleasant force named Beckley, fired at the man who he thought was an assailant, that's his word, who had lunged or jumped on DJ's car. That man thought that he was shooting at an assailant who he couldn't understand why had jumped on this car. He didn't know he was shooting at another police officer. It was the first time Beckley had fired his gun in 30 years on the police force. After he fired his gun, he saw the car careen, as it did, to the left. As it careened, it hit other vehicles, police vehicles, which were in a line. He saw the man who was on the vehicle thrown from the vehicle or dive off the vehicle. He wasn't sure. He ran over only to see that he'd shot another police officer. Beckley was mortified. DJ was dying. As Beckley was mortified, he tried to figure out what had happened and why this man had lunged on this vehicle. I would say, without being in his head, that he became somewhat sullen. He spent about an hour and a half then ferrying students back and forth from that scene to the police department to give their accounts to police agents about what had occurred. But by about 3 o'clock in the morning, he had become so disconsolate, he just went back to the police department, literally almost to cry, found a superior officer and told the superior officer what had occurred. That is, not that he had shot at the car or the occupant of the car, but that he had shot at the man who he saw jumping on the car for no apparent reason. The man he spoke with was a lieutenant in the police department named Finelli. Finelli is now either in federal prison or facing significant federal prison time for child pornography charges, but none of that was known at the time. At the time, he was lieutenant in the police agency at Mount Pleasant. That's what was known about him. Now here's where the media comes in. Finelli wrote a memorandum of his conversation with Beckley. Beckley told him that he had shot at the man who was lunging on the car. Finelli wrote that Beckley shot at the car. Police chief's name was Alagno. Alagno has since retired. Alagno called the press together after he briefed the White Plains, Westchester County District Attorney's Office, and the state police. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the account had been developed. DJ Henry was speeding, and 2 police officers had to fire at DJ Henry to protect their lives. And if you read back to October 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th, that's the account you're going to see in the local media. DJ Henry was speeding, and these 2 police officers, to protect themselves and the public, shot at him. Well, Hess, the shooter, never said anything. He didn't give an interview to the police themselves. They never commandeered him and required him to even give an interview, and he never gave an account of his behavior. He was the shooter. Beckley had given an account of his behavior. His account had been distorted by Finelli. Blue protects blue. The media, they ran right with it. There are hundreds of people at the scene who could have corroborated a different story about the rate of speed and other parts of the incident, but nobody interviewed them at that point. The police were telling the official story, the media was reporting the official story, and that would become, until we uncovered more, the official story. From the outset of it, the Tuesday following, which is when the Henrys came to me, the Henrys live in Easton, Massachusetts, but through various contacts called me to work on the case that Tuesday. I went to visit them that day up in Massachusetts. And upon hearing the account, I realized that the laws of physics didn't make any sense here, because if the car was going at a high rate of speed and the officer lunged or dived on the car, his head would be through the windshield, simply put. And that suggested to me the rate of speed from the outset had to be much less. It took us years to get accident reconstruction done. But when we got it done, it confirmed that the rate of speed was between 7 and 8 miles an hour when a man literally lunged on the car with his weapon drawn already, and within a second of being on the car, having never had his weapon dislodged by the act of lunging on the car, started shooting. The media had the whole story wrong. And it's taken years to unravel in the media what actually happened. The Beckley story came as a revelation in January of 2014 when we held a press conference at the Tarrytown Hilton, or whatever now it's called. The members of the media came and we had Beckley's deposition by then, and I shared it with them, and they were looking stunned because they'd been reporting a different story for, by then, more than 3 years. There have been other instances in this case of the use of the media that are interesting. DJ Henry parents, father's a executive at a Fortune 500 company. He's a graduate of Cornell. He was waitlisted at Harvard Law School. He would have gone to law school, but that's the only law school he wanted to go to from what he's told me, and he got waitlisted. His mother was a speech therapist. They're from Port Verde. They're very accomplished people. They live in what we would call in this area a mini mansion in a suburb, an almost all-white suburb of Easton, Massachusetts. They brought their kids up to be beyond race. It took them and has taken them years to believe that race played any role in this, and they still publicly have never acknowledged that race played any role in the killing of their son. Mr. Henry and I started calling for a special prosecutor in New York in every instance of police shooting, because what you have now and what you had then was a situation where the prosecutor for a county, which depends on the police departments in that county for cases, for cooperation, every single case involves a police department in the county. If one of those police agencies shoots someone, and kills someone, you have a district attorney who's bound up institutionally with that police department, the wrong person to be investigating police misconduct, certainly shootings. So Dan Henry and I began calling for a special prosecutor. You may know that a few months ago, Governor Cuomo finally acknowledged the problem institutionally, and he gave to the Attorney General of New York State the authority in every case of police shooting now to be the lead investigator and prosecutor, and took that role away from local district attorneys and police. About a week after I started publicly speaking to that effect, a member of the district attorney's office in Westchester County called me and said, we have the toxic reports on DJ Henry, and he was drunk, and we're going to release them publicly. And I said, I don't believe it for 1 minute. He wasn't drunk. We've interviewed 50, 75 people who were with him that night, including his parents, who, by the way, were with him until about 7 o'clock. He wasn't drinking. He may have had a sip of vodka with a mixed drink at some point about 10:30. That's it. We're going to release the report. In other words, using the press to try to intimidate me and Mr. Henry to stop advocating as we were advocating. It didn't work. They did release the report. Again, it dominated the news for months that DJ Henry was intoxicated, which frankly was an interesting issue because what did it have to do with the shooting? None of the police officers knew. Mr. Hess didn't have any idea that DJ Henry was or wasn't intoxicated. What he had was someone driving 7 or 8 miles an hour and he's stepping into the middle or running into the middle of the roadway without giving the person a time to stop entirely. So the media has been used and abused in this case repeatedly. There actually is a gag order now that we're not supposed to be talking to the press about the case because it got so ugly at points that the judges had to intervene. But I've continued to speak about the case in a way that I think accords the facts their due, because I think it's important that people understand, especially young people, understand what happened. So I don't know what you'd like me to address. I'm happy to speak about issues beyond this case, about this case. I think some of the students may have questions. I hope some of them have questions. You may have questions that you want answered.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask you just from a logistical standpoint, since you talked about the gag order, we do have a couple people who are with the school newspaper, the Base Chronicle. Is that okay that they're here?
I'm willing to take the heat, as they say. I mean, I feel that what's being said is factual. I'm not attacking anyone personally. The primary issue with the gag order was that people were making ad hominem personal attacks on other lawyers and on this and that, which I don't do. But I do think the facts of the case are fair game. I think that it's a matter of great public importance and concern, and it's been amply reported and misreported, as we've been talking about. And I think to set the record straight is always important. So yes, you can logistically, that's your answer.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions or, yes, please.
Why were the police initially called to the bar tavern? Was there like a dispute going on?
It's a good question.
Like why were they there?
It's a good question. First of all, the records show that the police were often at Finnegan's. There was, as I said earlier, I think it's fair to say, a great deal of underage drinking going on there, fake IDs. DJ himself had a fake ID. A lot of the students had fake IDs, from what we could tell. There's no evidence that DJ bought or got a drink there, but there's evidence that to get in the bar, kids were using fake IDs, and I assume from some of the smiles I'm seeing that hasn't stopped. Now, some of the smirks and smiles, let me put it that way. You're not on camera. I'm the only one on camera. So what happened is around 1 o'clock, there are disputes as to what exactly happened, but suffice it to say, 2 things apparently happened. Someone did damage to a window at Finnegan's, and the owner, Mr. Van Ostrand, became aware of that, and apparently he or one of his staff people called the police. And there was also some sort of altercation that did not involve DJ or any of his friends going out on in the street with a person from Pace who apparently was known to be something of a brawler. And he was at it again, and the police were called. However, what's noteworthy is when the police got to the scene, the first officer at the scene called in and said, everything's under control, and tried to redirect the other officers away because there was no need for them. As it turned out, 5 or 6 cars at least still came, including the shooter's car. So I don't think anyone could say that pre the shooting anything was out of control. There had been a call, though, clearly made, at least one, and there was some provocation for it. But as I said, by the time the police actually arrived, it had somehow cleaned itself up. Steve Van Ostrand, the tavern owner, was speaking right before the shooting with several of the police officers, and he testified under oath that he was speaking about the damage to the window. But no one was doing any police work. They were standing around. As I said, DJ and many other young people, and this is where the issue of race first came in, because from what we've been able to tell, all of the students who were parked in front except for DJ were Caucasians. And it appears that the police officer did go to DJ's car and may have gone only to DJ's car to have him move. It was clear they were waiting for friends. The bar was being closed. It was between 1 and 1:15. The tavern owner had turned off and blinked the lights. Everybody was being told to leave the bar. DJ left the bar with 2 of his 4 friends, but was waiting for the other 2, who apparently was still dancing inside and trying to get somebody's phone number. That's what kids do, right? All right, so that was the scene. Anyone else? Yes?
What had happened after DJ was shot? Was there anything done? Was he left in the car? Did something happen?
Yeah.
Did they try to resolve that?
Well, there's a lot that happened, and it does form the basis for part of the lawsuit. So the shots were fired, and as I mentioned earlier, the car careened, he losing control of the car careened to its left. And from what I can tell and what the experts have told me, it accelerated before it careened, hit a car, then stopped. It might have gotten up to about 20 to 25 miles an hour as it careened after the shooting. The car stopped, and 2 police officers ran to the car. They immediately opened the door. They took control of DJ's body. DJ, according to them, stood up, and they believed he was alive, breathing. That's their testimony. They threw him to the ground. They cuffed him behind his back, and he lay in the ground. We have video of this. It's horrible. He lay there for, it's unclear exactly how long, but let me put it this way. He lay there between 5 and 14 minutes. No medical attention was provided. The ambulance corps, by the way, was across the street. I don't know how well you know the area from the Thornwood Shopping Center. It's across the street. And when the first members of the ambulance corps got there, Hess, the shooter, was, if you looked at their arrival, they arrive, Hess is there sitting up, and DJ is back here laying out. They attend to Hess, and very quickly they then go and see DJ. A stretcher is brought, they put DJ, this is all on tape, they put DJ on the stretcher. There's a long delay. And during the delay, he's basically dying in the street. We have a survivability expert. A survivability expert is someone who looks at the nature of the injuries, because the family obviously, once they saw this tape, was horrified about letting their son essentially die in the roadway. So I employed the most well-regarded survivability cardiologist in the country, Dr. Meyerberg from the University of Miami, who's a man in his probably late 70s, who's published 400 or 500 articles based on his own research on survivability issues. He's indicated that there's probably between a 10 and 15% chance, but not much greater chance, that a DJ got an immediate medical attention, which by that he means within a 10-minute period, he might have survived. So that's not a high percentage, but it's some percentage. And that chance was denied by the reactions of those who responded, several of whom, by the way, were trained as paramedics. Yes?
So was it the ambulance's fault that they went to Hess first, or did the police tell them to go?
The real issue is why it took them so long to get there relatively, given their close proximity. It was 1:30 in the morning, so folks did have to marshal from wherever they were to get there. I don't think, as I said earlier, they spent very much time with Hess before they were directed toward DJ. Yeah, go ahead.
Hess walked, right? So there's nothing that you could do and no.
Hess is the subject of a federal civil rights suit. So it's not that there's nothing that we can do. Criminally, the family did seek criminal prosecution. The district attorney went to a grand jury, did not get an indictment. The Justice Department decided not to convene a grand jury after an alleged investigation. And so there's no criminal prosecution of Hess. The only recourse is civil. It's something like the O.J. Simpson situation, where he was exonerated criminally and then a jury found him liable civilly.
Were there any surveillance cameras in the shopping center that could have caught the car on video not going 25 miles an hour?
Yes. Our accident reconstructionist has made significant use of a number of surveillance cameras. The surveillance cameras do have times on them and seconds, and you can tell where they are, and from that you can reconstruct speed. Unfortunately,
Going like 5 miles an hour.
yeah. Unfortunately, what you cannot see for many of them is the actual shooting and the actual actions of Mr. Hess. Nor,
Him lunge on the
no,
floor?
no, that's his, as I said earlier, his testimony, yes.
Were there eyewitness accounts of him lunging onto the car?
What's actually interesting is that the police officers generally were not those who were there, and there were, as I mentioned earlier, others there. Their attention was not particularly directed at him. There may have been one or two who gave some testimony. The testimony about his action comes from himself. And while it was being publicly stated that the car, slammed into him and all of this other stuff, he himself testified about that. That's the word he used. In fact, at the hospital, there's a recordation from the hospital of what he told medical personnel. He used that term then. There are also other records which have been made available to us which have accounts by him that are similar.
Who exactly decides if he gets an indictment or not?
Sorry, say
Who
that.
exactly deciding if Hess should be indicted or not?
In criminal law, there's a general maxim that a district attorney can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. That's generally what's spoken of. And what's meant by that is that normally a grand jury is used to determine whether there is a basis, a reasonable basis to have someone face criminal charges and have a criminal trial. A grand jury is not normally a place where both sides come and give their account of events. It's certainly not a place where the district attorney normally invites the defense to present its case. In this case, that was not the case. There was a very clear determination by your district attorney, Ms. DiFiore, to have the police case presented to the grand jury. So the grand jury, and they're the only lawyer in the room, just the district attorney's office. So their attitude toward the case has a huge amount of bearing on whether there'll be an indictment.
So DJ Henry's family wasn't allowed to speak at all, present anything?
DJ Henry's father was brought into the grand jury for, I believe, between 10 and 15 minutes. His mother, but again, they were not witnesses. I would not necessarily expect that they would be brought in. But I would expect Beckley to have been brought in and Beckley to have given his account. And I would expect some of the students, we have 7 or 8 students, to go back to your question about eyewitnesses, who were quite clear about what happened, to be brought in. And I would expect an indictment to have been returned and the matter then to have been tried in a public manner, so the public would know. If you remember, grand juries are secret. We haven't been able to get the grand jury transcripts or exhibits in this case. It's all secret. We made an application within about a month of the shooting and we were denied.
Disgusting.
Can you talk at all about, there weren't just lawsuits against Aaron Hess, right? There have been other parties involved. Can you give us an idea of what other
Sure.
legal action has been involved?
Sure. Well, to go back really to your question about what happened afterwards. DJ was very popular, as I said earlier. He was not only very dashing, he was a very good person. Everything I've learned about him is that. And he had friends across the spectrum. He wasn't a person who had a little clique of friends. He was someone who had friends. He was very charismatic. He was a great dancer. He was very religious. He was a very multifaceted person. He was very bright. He was a great athlete. And as I said to you earlier, he came from a family that saw the world and still sees the world to a large extent beyond race. His father is a corporate HR director of a Fortune 500 company. His mother is a speech pathologist who works in in the area of Massachusetts where there are not very many African Americans live. The reaction to the shooting was nothing short of pandemonium, I think it's fair to say. There was a very strong reaction by the students. And a lot of that is captured on video that we have. The police were trying to protect the crime scene, however one defines the crime scene. That was their intention. And the students saw that no one was helping DJ. So that led to efforts by some of the students, particularly his football player colleagues, many of them were there, to try to help DJ, because a lot of them knew first aid. And they were watching DJ lying on the ground, nothing happening. So the police, at least one police officer, took out his weapon, and there's some very attractive young ladies from Pace who were trying to get to DJ, and you see these photos. I'm sure some of you may have seen the video of them pointing the gun at these young ladies, and again, it was a bad scene. There was some physical force and violence used against the students. Two young men were in the car when DJ was shot. One of them was shot in the left arm. That's Brandon Cox, who was DJ's best friend, and he was a football player for the other school that played DJ that day, Stonehill. And DJ's family and the Cox's family, after the game, had dinner together at an Italian restaurant in the area. The Cox family stayed and took DJ's sister, Amber, to a Broadway show that night, so they were still in New York when the shooting happened. The Henrys and their other son went back to Boston area. So Brandon was shot. Brandon was dazed. Brandon understood what had happened to DJ. And Desmond Hines, an African-American football player who has long dreads, something like yours, beautiful, no, yours. Another, just a beautiful kid. I mean, I love these kids. I mean, like they're my own. I have 7 children, many of whom are the same age that you all are. So, you know, when I started to get to know these young men, I was just very impressed with them. And Des was in the back seat of the car, and several bullets came into the back seat, but none hit him. When the car stopped, he got out of the car, and he claims that he was brutalized by police officers. So to go to your question, there are 7 students, Pace University students, who brought lawsuits based on what happened afterwards. And then there's an 8th student, Brandon, who wasn't a student at Pace at that time, as I said, he was at Stonehill, who brought a lawsuit based on the shooting. And we have 2 lawsuits. So there are 10 lawsuits. We have 1 lawsuit relating to the shooting, and we have 1 lawsuit relating to the aftermath of the shooting. And they're separate because at the beginning, we were not inclined to file a lawsuit about what happened afterwards. It was only when we got the video and saw DJ lying on the ground that we did that, and got deposition testimony from officers who went to the car, said they thought DJ was alive, and threw him on the ground, handcuffed him behind his back, and did nothing to attend to him. I thought that was egregious, and I thought that we needed to respond to that legally, as did the Henrys. Yes, and then
I'm slightly confused as to why he got handcuffed in the first place.
It's really not for me to try to explain some of these protocols, because I'm not the author of them, and I'm not really able to articulate clearly some of the reasons. From my point of view, DJ was someone who was engaged in no unlawful behavior. who really had done nothing wrong. He was shot, mortally wounded. Police ran to the vehicle knowing he had been shot, yet when they were questioned, they acted like they had no idea he had been shot. And handcuffing him is part of that, having no idea that he had been shot, from my perspective. When you ask people in their depositions, that deposition, for those of you who don't understand it, is when you're preparing for a trial, and we're still preparing for the trials in these cases 5 years later, you take the deposition testimony of people, the sworn testimony of witnesses, so that you know what they're going to say to prepare for trial. So when I say the depositions, we've taken the testimony of the people involved. I have DJ Henry's car at my farm in Orange County. I got it a few months ago. It had been kept over here at the police barracks on Sawmill River Parkway for the last 4+ years. And when the Justice Department decided not to prosecute, I felt like there was no need for it to be kept there, and I felt that it shouldn't be, that the Henrys didn't want it back for obvious reasons. But I felt that it was kind of part of our history, and I didn't want to see it junked. So I had a tower tow it to my house. And I have kids. I have a 16-year-old still and a 15-year-old, and I have older kids, and they've been obviously involved in this case through their father from the beginning and know the Henrys. They know the Henrys' children. And I wanted them to see what it actually looked like. And the reason I'm bringing that up now is that the idea that you wouldn't, running to the scene, know that DJ was mortally wounded is hard to fathom when you look at the windshield of the car. The bullet holes are this big. Remember that a lot of police agencies, we're doing right now in our office 7 cases involving young people who are shot by the police. DJ Henry's not the only victim. And one of the things we've been finding is that the ammunition being used, the weaponry being used by the police almost guarantees that there would be mortal wounds in these situations. Many of the situations, if not all of them, if any force is necessary, it's not that sort of force. But the line from 0 to 100 gets crossed very quickly. Anything else? You had your hand up, I think.
You're the first person I've ever heard that said for sure that DJ was not drinking that night and wasn't drunk. Where exactly did the claims that he was drinking come from?
Well, this is a complicated story. Some of it's not really yet even out in the public. So I'm just going to speak a little bit generally about this. There are several reasons for doubt as to his drinking or not drinking. One of the eyewitnesses, and to me the strongest eyewitness is Steve Van Ostrand, the tavern owner. Because as he said, he makes his living dealing with drunk people, and especially drunk young people. And he's very able to discern and tell when someone's had too much to drink. That's his account of himself, which I have no reason to disbelieve. He's been a tavern owner for many years. So when he gave testimony, the other thing is he's pro-police in general. His orientation is pro-police, not anti-police. So when he gave testimony and was so clear about DJ's state of mind, and I put that testimony up with the students and young people who DJ had been with that evening, who might have a desire to defend DJ, they're his friends. I put that with everyone else, all the other students, many of whom were not particularly DJ's friends. No one saw DJ drinking, no drinks were served to DJ. A young blonde girl was dancing with DJ, and she was questioned, and she said he wouldn't drink, he didn't drink. All the other kids in the car said, we have a designated driver, it was DJ. So there's no evidence that anybody actually saw him drinking. The only admission that was made was that a number of them went to a liquor store, they did buy liquor. DJ did go into the liquor store, and there is clearly an admission, and I think it's true, that there were some mixed drinks that they had between probably 10 o'clock and 11:30, and the DJ had half a cup of a mixed drink, which would never account for a high blood alcohol level. Second point, no toxicity studies were done of DJ's body until hours after he passed. And the science of it is that there's a degradation of ethanol in your system such that a blood alcohol reading increases after morbidity, after you die. So, and I've spoken with some of the leading doctors in the world about this, and all of them confirm that. So to the extent a sample was taken 3, 4 hours, 5 hours after his death, you would expect it to be higher than it would be in terms of what he ingested.
But the media picked up that he was drinking at night.
Yeah, let me get to the third point, because the third point's the most interesting, probably. And I haven't discussed this publicly, so I'm going to speak only in generalities. We have reason to believe that there was a tainting or corruption of the sample, done intentionally. And we have reason to believe we know who did that and why it was done. Again, that has not really come out yet in any particular form, and it probably won't come out until trial, but it will come out. Next. There may not be a next.
It's quite a tease from a journalistic standpoint.
Well.
So back to, you said that there were 10 total lawsuits. How many of them have yet to be resolved?
None of them have been resolved.
Okay.
None of the lawsuits have been resolved. The lawsuits were all consolidated for purposes of discovery. That means discovery and all the lawsuits proceeded together. And we're now at the stage in all the lawsuits where we, the plaintiffs are the people who bring a lawsuit, defendants are the people who defend the lawsuit. We have submitted our expert reports to the other side, which is the end part of discovery. We're waiting to get their expert reports, then there'll be rebuttal reports, and then there'll be depositions if people choose to have them of the expert witnesses. That will conclude discovery. So, yes?
When do you think that's going to happen?
The expert reports will probably be, expert discovery should be done by the end of the year. And then defendants will have a chance to make motions, which is a whole other part of lawyering. And they can make motions to try to have the court say there is no material issue of disputed fact. It's clear the defendants are innocent or not liable. And if the judge agrees, the judge can throw the case or some of the cases out. Again, I won't comment on that more than explaining what I've explained to you. Yes?
Do you think this case, one of the articles that we had to read before having you come in and talk, discussed.
I'm sorry, I made you read articles?
No,
I
sorry,
didn't know.
no.
Your teacher did that?
It was to be informed, no.
I'm kidding you, I'm
It
kidding
came out
you.
wrong. But it kind of discussed how DJ Henry's family didn't want him to become like one of the Trayvon Martins and one of the Michael Browns.
You read Lisa Belkin's article.
Yes.
She's the same woman who wrote Show Me a Hero, by the way.
Do you agree with that? Like, do you think he should be among the names that are said in this case of like white police officer on black male
Yeah.
shooting? Do you think that it goes within that?
I think the article, as I remember, I know Lisa quite well because she was the New York Times reporter who covered the Yonkers case, which lasted from 1981 to 2007, just to have your facts right. It wasn't in the 80s. It lasted for 26 years. I represented the NAACP for 26 years, not for a few years. The story, Show Me a Hero, is about a 5-year period from 1987, roughly to 2000, from 1987 to 1992-3. I've been a civil rights lawyer since I got out of Harvard Law School in 1978. I went to the Civil Rights Division. I went to the NAACP National Office. I started my own civil rights firm, and I've been a civil rights lawyer for 37 years. In fact, October 10th will be the 37th year anniversary for me. So I obviously see the world a certain way and do what I've done because I have certain values that I believe in. As a lawyer, I try to respect my client's perspective. I appreciate the Henry's perspective, which is that they want the distinct and unique characteristics of their son to be more remembered than that he is one of a string of people whose names are used to signify some cause. In summarizing it, that's what I think is a fair way of putting their perspective. I think you can have, in a certain way, both, and you have to realize in this world both are true. To his loved ones, to the people who he touched, to people who will read about him in more detail, he'll always be someone special. Special for who he particularly was in this world, not simply for the way he died. On the other hand, it's hard to look at the facts of this case, starting even with the knocking on the windshield, because it was so obvious why he was in the fire lane with all these other people in the fire lane. It's hard to look at the facts of the case from the beginning, if you will, of police involvement to the end, including what we spoke about earlier, being handcuffed, thrown on the gutter, to lay there, without thinking that on some level race plays a role. But I think that for me, I come to that conclusion after 40 years of being integrally involved in cases where I've seen the lives and purposes of African American people devalued in our society. So for me to see this in another way when it seems such a graphic illustration of that by so many people would be quite inconsistent with my own eyes. That everybody doesn't see the world as Michael Sussman does, and I realize that. Not everybody has had my experiences, not everybody has my commitment. And there are people who fundamentally disagree with my assessment of where we are as a society. But when you look at the drug laws in our country, which are not new, and the way they've criminalized certain drugs and not other drugs, when you go to courts in communities which are racially mixed and see how judges treat African American young people compared to white young people, and I've been there, I can't form any other conclusion than that race is still a very strong factor in many of the decisions in our society. Now, when I say that, I recognize I'm in an audience with some white students and some African American students. And I also recognize that in the world we live in, we can't, and this is the Henry's point, we can't teach our children that they should be any less than they can be because of their race. We don't want them to have a view that if they're as good as they can be, they'll be penalized or held back because of their race. And I understand where that's coming from. And we have a Supreme Court of the United States which has said that school districts that attempt voluntarily to integrate students on the basis of race are violating the United States Constitution. That's the world you live in. Seattle had a program of desegregating its public schools that the Supreme Court of the United States found unconstitutional because it used race as one of the factors in student assignments so as to minimize segregation. The Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional. So we have a society in which, from my point of view, we have some people totally blind to the need for public policy to address segregation, however it was caused. We have some people who want to be in denial about race mattering. I can't be based on my life experience. In the first week in August, I went to Mississippi for a week to work on education cases in the state of Mississippi. In the state of Mississippi, which is a state that is one of the blackest states in the country, 45% of the people in the state are black. You have 60,000 classified students in the state, students who have been deemed by school districts to be in need of special services. You have 4 lawyers in the whole state working to help those students get the services they need. You have districts that are in rampant disregard of federal law, and there's no way to get enforcement. And a large disproportionate number of those students are African American. So how can their lives be viewed as mattering as much? I told my own children that this is a challenge for them, and I think, all 7 of them realize that on some level. I feel terribly that after all my years of work and many other people's years of work in this area, we're sort of going around in circles. And I think we are, to some extent, going around in circles. And part of that is denial. You know, when the movie came out, Show Me a Hero, a lot of people from the press called me and wanted to do interviews and all the rest of it. What's the most significant part of the case? And I told all of them, the most significant part of the case is Judge Sand's decision, which is 750 pages long and chronicles the history of racial segregation in Yonkers, New York. All right, 750 pages. Talks about where public housing sites were put, who was allowed in them and who was not allowed in them. Talks about all sorts of decision-making that was going on in the city and how race was a primary factor in this northern city 10 miles from here. And yet, Judge Sand wrote that decision in November of 2000, excuse me, I get the 2000s confused, November of 1985. 3 years, 2.5 years later, Governor Mario Cuomo was governor of New York State. He was a proclaimed progressive and liberal. He called me on the telephone in my office after he had stated that there was no racism in Yonkers. Harry Belafonte and Lena Horne could live anywhere in Yonkers. There's no racism in Yonkers. And in the front page of the New York Times, I basically called him an ignoramus and said, what are you talking about? And he called me on the phone and he said, how dare you, how dare you? And I said, you're a constitutional lawyer? You're the governor of our state? Did you read the opinion? Did you read the Second Circuit's affirmance of the decision in full? 2 Reagan appointees writing for the court? But there's a profound state of denial on this issue. And I don't think that denial is only felt by whites. I think some African Americans feel that denial because you want to feel that denial. You don't want to feel that your race is going to be a hindrance in our society. Who would want to feel that? Who would want to experience daily life thinking that about themselves? Somehow there are people who are not going to regard me as capable because of my race without ever getting to know me. Who wants to think that? How can you teach your children? That's what you should think. So it's not surprising that on both sides there are going to be these issues of denial and anyone else?
You mentioned that you still have, or that you currently have 7 other cases involving students?
Well, young people. I guess
Young
probably they were all students if I thought about it, but some of them aren't students. Some of them are people who are, you know, in their 20s or teens and not students.
Are there any common threads to those cases, or can you talk at all about those cases?
Well, from my perspective, the common thread is official overreaction, misestimation of something as a threat that's not a threat, putting yourself in a situation where you're using lethal force and then claiming that's the only thing I could have done, even though there was no reason for you to have been there to begin with. One of the cases comes out of Newburgh. Are any of you from Newburgh or Orange? Are any of you from Orange County? No? So do you know where Newburgh is? Nobody? Has anybody ever heard of Newburgh? Wow, 1, 2 of you. So Newburgh's about 25 miles from here. It's a very poor city on the Hudson River. Black and Latino population in the city is about 75% today. There's a young man. He has a warrant for some very petty matters. I mean, when I say petty, you know, marijuana thing, he didn't follow up and go to court. He was supposed to pay a fine, he didn't go to court. Nothing violent, nothing serious, nothing that you would say, God, he's a threat. There's a squad in the city of Newburgh Police Department. It's called kind of a goon squad. And they drive around the city. And from what we've been told over many years, they beat kids up. They saw this young man on his porch, probably smoking a joint, but I don't know for sure. They ran out of their car, and he ran into his sister's house. That was the porch he was at. And 4 of them ran into the house. And within 5 minutes, he was dead, shot 14 times, 8 times in the back. In his sister's house. The shooting was in the residence. No, it was like midnight at night. I'll give you a chance in a minute. It was about midnight at night, and one could think that, well, all we're doing is executing kind of a, you know, sort of meaningless warrant. These are not, as I said, it's not a murder, it's not a robbery, it's not a burglary, it's not a sexual assault, it's some minor infraction. They claim he ran into his sister's apartment, he grabbed a knife, he was chasing 4 police officers around with a knife, and the only thing they could do was shoot him 14 times. The only witnesses were 2 sisters who were sleeping upstairs who had, during the fracas, heard and one watched, and they contradict what the police said was going on, but again, that's the kind of thing you have. So when I say put yourselves in a position where, why are they running into the house and breaking the door down? Another issue that's sort of common, several of the shooters have been recently in the Middle East. Several of the shooters were dealing with checkpoints in Iraq and Afghanistan. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about is situations where you put young Americans in a foreign country and they don't know who is on which side. And there's a checkpoint, and people have been blown up at checkpoints like that by people in cars. And their job is to check, and sometimes they misapprehend who's there, and they shoot and they kill a totally innocent citizen. Sometimes they kill the people's children. And that's called in war collateral damage. When you bring that home, it's a little bit of a different situation. So, yeah.
Are any of these officers on the not paid leave, just they're not allowed to work, or are they all still working?
Well, in one case in Middletown, we found out last week, I haven't talked about that case yet at all, but a young man was shot to death on a street in Middletown in broad daylight. And we found out last week at his deposition that one of the shooters had shot before, had gone out on PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and then was allowed back to work and given a gun. And within a reasonably short time, shot again and killed someone, or contributed to that death. I believe his bullet certainly hit the gentleman. So, that's where we are. Yes?
Have you only represented minorities
Oh, no.
in your cases?
Oh, no. Oh, no. We don't have any rule like that. White people have gotten shot, too, on occasion. We had a case in Yonkers 30 years ago for an Italian young man, I remember very clearly. Right now, we have a case for another Italian gentleman who was shot to death by the state police up in Fishkill. No, there's no racial litmus test. But unfortunately, I say unfortunately, there are too many of these altogether, but unfortunately, disproportionate number of victims are people of color. Yes?
What was it like representing the Henry family?
It's a great honor, truthfully. The Henry family, as I've said before here, are they're extraordinary people. They're both very engaged. They came to many of the depositions, particularly the important depositions, and watched me question the shooter of their son. It's not easy. They're both very, very bright, and they had tremendously high aspirations for their children, just like I have for my children. And they're obviously devastated in a way that they'll never be able to transcend, but on October 24th, they're giving the 4th gala for the DJ Dream Foundation. They've raised hundreds of thousands, if not more money, and given it to underprivileged children so they could go to camp, go to art classes, go to dance classes, go to music classes, go to sports events that they otherwise couldn't have gone to. The gala brings together Charlie Baker is now governor of the state, has gone to every gala before he was governor. Last year I sat with one of the Kennedys, who's a congressman, sitting next to me. He comes to the gala. A lot of the important political and media people in Massachusetts go to the gala and have helped raise money. So they're incredibly accomplished people. They want justice for their son. They've been tremendously disappointed in the criminal justice system. But I'll tell you this without any leak of attorney-client privilege, because Mr. Henry said this publicly many times, and I've said it. When I met with them that Tuesday in their study of their house, they said to me, all we want you to do is find out the truth about what happened to DJ. That's what we really want. We don't, Mr. Henry and Miss Henry make plenty of money. It was never about anything like that. Tell us what happened to our son. Have this man criminally prosecuted, which was beyond my capacity. The other thing that I'd say about them, the first day I went there that Tuesday, it's a kind of funny story in the midst of this tragedy. I was given the address, and there were a bunch of cars parked outside this large home. And I went to the front door, and I knocked, and probably unsurprisingly, nobody heard the knock, and the door was open. So I walked in, and nobody came to the door, toward the door. And I heard this really strong brogue coming from an area to my left behind the wall. And I wondered if I was in the right place. All I knew is this African-American young man had been shot to death. This was where his family was. And I'm hearing this brogue out of somewhere in Northern Ireland, thinking, what is going on here? Little did I know that DJ's mother is from, her dad's Cape Verdean, her mother's Caucasian. And Irish, and very Irish. And the whole family is there. The whole Irish family is there celebrating DJ's life. DJ was their shining star. So they were trying to teach their children, as I said earlier, that they could do anything and be anything, and they should not let any external, superficial matter stop them. And they were committed to that.
Do you think that anything has changed among the police departments that were involved, or do you think that this same scenario could happen today?
Well, the way to answer that question is that a couple of years ago, the police department that Mr. Hess worked for gave him Police Officer of the Year after the shooting. He was awarded Police Officer of the Year. No, I don't see a lot of evidence that no. One police chief retired. His successor, Finelli, is either in federal prison or is going to federal prison on pornography charges. I mean, I don't know, child pornography charges, by the way. I don't know what to tell you. What I can say, is that most of us, and you're all young, except for a couple of us, find our daily lives too occupying to involve ourselves in the world beyond it. That's a problem in a democracy. It's a big problem in a democracy. Our institutions become very much vested. What that means is that they do what they need to do to survive and continue on. And the impetus for change is sometimes very minimal. And that comes, if it comes from people from the outside of those institutions critiquing them, and I think the media there has a huge role. My uncle was the Watergate editor of the Washington Post, Barry Sussman. He was Woodward and Bernstein's boss during Watergate. I was lucky enough to be down there the summer of 1973 working for Jimmy Carter then, and I watched the Watergate story unfolding. That was the apex of investigative journalism. So you want to study journalism, you want to be involved in journalism, that's a time period to look at, because journalists were committed to changing institutions by finding out what was truly going on and divulging that. And they viewed that as a way change would happen in the society. Again, truth-telling, much like what I said about the importance of the Yonkers case. Tell the story. Hope people can understand that story and grow from it, just like in your personal lives. So when I watched Barry, Carl Bernstein, and Bob Woodward work on that story, and I was sitting in the next room as they were sitting in the basement of Barry Sussman's house doing their work night after night, I understood that we need strong investigative journalists. So that's a key thing. I hope some of you take that seriously and do it. It's not easy, because you're not, it's like what I do. You're not going to be universally loved. My father used to say to me before he passed, if you do this work and you think you're going to be universally loved, you're crazy. And I said, whoever said that's what I thought. It's never what I aspired to.